Okay, so we're heading over to the Netherlands briefly to discuss Piet-Mondrian, but I want us to come back to a lot of Malavic's ideas. He uses this black square, these simplified compositions in order to create this universal art that will speak to anyone, that anyone can understand it. You don't need to have any education in art or background or literacy or knowledge outside of the fact that this is a square, that this geometry speaks to everyone. And so he sees this as suprematism is your way of viewing the world through the ultimate reality of pure feeling. He's trying to get to this purity, this essence, and he sees geometry as a means of doing so. And so we need to have that in consideration when discussing Piet-Mondrian and the idea of distill. And he incorporates these ideas into what he calls this neoplasticism. He even wrote this essay about it, where he said, this new plastic idea will ignore the particulars of appearance, that is to say, natural form and color. On the contrary, it should find its expression in the abstraction of form and color, that is to say, in the straight line and clearly defined primary color. So here he is rejecting illusionism like what we've seen. He's embracing geometry, lines, and primary colors. So we're coming to these essentials, where we have just our primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, these black lines, and then painted white squares. All of his artworks look like this. You will now forever recognize Mondrian's. They're in most museums across the globe. Our MFA has a few. And so they're easily recognizable. And so he's coming to this idea of this true essence, the universality of geometry, essentially, of these geometric shapes. So he's also rejecting the idea of this balanced composition. This is extremely asymmetrical. So again, we're rejecting these notions of art that have been around for centuries in order to define this new art that's in this new era, 1930. And so it's this pursuit of an honest and pure style. We only have these right angles, this very grid-like form. There's no shading. There's no colors besides these primary colors, so you aren't even mixing other ones. And so he's also really interested in the material properties of paint. Like other artists, come back to with our post-impressionists, with Cézanne, and how his basket of apples, how he's saying, oh, this changing perspective is reality. And he's also pointing out how this is a painting. He's not trying to create something illusionistic. Instead, this is a painting. And then we have Van Gogh with this thick impasto. This is a painting. Look at this paint. And so Piet-Mondrian is also remarking on this is a painting. Look at this paint. And so what's interesting is this is oil on canvas, but however he mixed these oils, whatever he used, it's been cracking over time. So this isn't the photograph, this is the actual painting. There's major cracking throughout them. And some art historians argue that this was intentional because all of his paintings are going through this stage of essentially almost like a decay. They're changing. And so there's this debate amongst museums of, well, his intention was for this to essentially almost disappear to an extent with time. So do we restore it or do we let it continue cracking as he intended? So there's this debate. But again, it brings your attention to the fact that this is paint. This is a painting. He's not trying to create anything realistic or natural or experimenting with illusionism. But yeah, now you shall forever recognize Piet-Mondrian's. Okay, so let's talk about Varvara Stepanova and the Soviet Avant-Garde photo montage, illustration from the results of the first 5-year plan. So we've discussed the Chinese Communist Party's attempt at this push for agricultural industrialization in a short period of time. The same thing occurs within the USSR, where Russia is way behind, and so Stalin creates this 5-year plan that we are going to catch up in terms of industry and agriculture within 5 years with the rest of Europe that is now modernized. And of course, just like with China's attempt, especially with the collectivization of farms, this results in great famine, starvation, and the death of millions. But are we going to admit to that? Absolutely not. Under these communist regimes, everything is about propaganda. And so this artwork was created to give this propagandic notion that this was successful. But let me back up with some of the formal elements of this to kind of set the tone. So we have this new era. I talked about how, like, with this new Russia, this new society, these creative schools of thought and these creative people are coming forth, and they're like, okay, we're working with like a blank slate. How are we going to create this new world? And so in the art world, there's initially this push for the idea of constructivists. This is the Soviet avant-garde, where they're rejecting traditional art, like what we're seeing across the globe. And now they're going to use these new modern industrial materials. For example, like look at this steel, and also it's supposed to be constructed with glass. And they're supposed to represent this idea of activity and production. And this is what the USSR is trying to push, is produce, catch up, production, this elevation of the proletariat of the workers. And so the art's going to try to reflect that change, or at least that's what the artists want. This was supposed to be, or this is the model for this sculpture that was supposed to be taller than the Eiffel Tower. On the inside, it was supposed to have some office buildings that would rotate slowly. And just like any communist regime, this initially seems all fun as these revolutionaries are trying to create this new world, but then it's completely rejected by the regime. It's too revolutionary for them. We need to stick to our communist art and our communist ideals under this communist leadership. And so this doesn't come to fruition. And like with many artists, they're kind of pushed out of society to an extent. But this idea of activity and production and this use of modern materials is seen in our Stepanova's artwork, our 5-year plan, and the results of the first 5-year plan. She said, I wanted to produce actual objects, a total material environment in which the living human material was to act. So what does that mean? Again, we have these new means of production, of industrialization with these power lines. Russia is moving forward. We have this massive workers protesting and flags, etc. Again, the rise of the workers and the elevation of their hard work and what this is produced. But like I said, this is completely propagandistic. We know it was a massive failure. Millions died. The world's population was half what it was, or half of what it is currently. So this is significant. But to the outside world, they're not going to admit that. Instead, they're going to pretend like it was a total success. And this was actually the cover of this article, of this magazine called USSR in Construction. And it was sent out to numerous European countries. And Stalin himself, okay, like the worst dictator in history, Hitler killed 14 million, Stalin killed at least 20 million that we know of. And so, anyway, so Stalin himself authored this article called Results of the First 5-Year Plan, Fulfilled in 4. And it was this completely propagandistic fake article about how he said all of the goals of the 5-year plan were achieved, but also they were achieved within 4 years. And he creates this whole story as if it was this total success. And this cover is supposed to reflect that. We see this 5 here. The 5-year plan was successful. We've not only industrialized, we're on the newest technology. Look at these power lines. All the people have united as one. This CCCP is Russia for our Communist Party. And so it's this propaganda, false elevation of this 5-year plan. And of course, the red throughout is your color for communism. And so here's another example, one of many throughout history of propaganda, but to a very, very falsified extent. So yeah, in photo montage, we haven't seen much of that, but it's, of course, this combination of collage of different photos. Comments, questions, concerns? Okay, let's talk about Pablo Picasso's Guernica. This is another Cubist painting where we have these elements pieced together. And this has been described as the last great history painting. So this, you watched a video about the Spanish Civil War, and this was made during the Spanish Civil War. So remember we talked about with World War I, Spain was going through their own issues. They weren't involved with World War I. They were the only ones to talk about the Spanish flu. So they've been doing their own thing and having their own political upheaval, essentially. So what you have is this civil war is the Republicans versus the Nationalists. Now, the Republicans end up being supported by the Soviet Union, which is funny because the Republicans want a democratically elected government, which the Soviet Union isn't about. But the reason why the Soviet Union involved themselves was because the other side in Spain, the Nationalists, were supported by Nazi Germany. Okay, so they've already been at heads with one another. And so, essentially it ends up that the Nationalists win. Part of that is because of the extreme incompetence of the Soviet Union's army. For, centuries, Russia has had an extremely large population. And so for like all wars in their history, pretty much, they didn't ever worry about the body count. Just throw millions at the enemy, and that's how they win. Only the Mongols were ever able to an extent, defeat part of Russia because, winters, but also because the Russians just kind of didn't care about the people. We can see why they rose up with our communist revolution. There's always more fatalities on the Russian side for any war that they've ever been involved in because the bourgeois didn't really care. But what happens here is they bring those ideas into Spain, and so it's just complete incompetence. So for example, like let's say you have some battle going on in the streets and the Republicans under Soviet leadership have run out of bullets. The Soviets would tell these Spaniards they still need to run at the enemy, even without any type of weaponry. And if the guys are like, we don't have any weapons, we're going out for, this is a suicide mission, let's regroup and come up with another plan, these incompetent Soviet leaders would say, oh, you're trying to run away from the army. My mind's gone blank. You're a traitor. And they'd like shoot them all just at gunpoint right then and there if they refused to fight. So, really, it was like the incompetence of the Soviet Union that led the other side, the nationalists, somewhat fascist regime to win. And they were under that leadership. And so this defines World War II as well. But really in Spain, what we're looking at initially is you've got Lenin, Stalin, and the USSR. They're the ones who are backing the Republicans versus the fascists, Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, who invented the term, Franco to an extent in Spain, at least he's supported by them. And so just kind of some background, like communism, it's based on division, the bourgeois versus the proletariat. And they want class differences to disappear, this idea of international brotherhood, this destruction of the middle and upper class. Everyone is collectivized in this peasant class. Private property doesn't exist. It's all owned by the state. You don't even own the furniture in your home. You have a marker that it's by the state. Rapid industrialization, collective agriculture, failures. Fascism, again, they want national community. Their division is based on race. Again, they're all based on division. They glorified war and military. That's why you think of the Nazis, even with the Hitler Youth being in these military marches. They destroyed workers' movements, so different than communism. And they were really pro-big business through the corporative state. It's like corporations, like imagine like Coca-Cola Company or Johnson & Johnson being involved in politics. It was one and the same. Both end up being ruled by dictators, one-party rule, deny individual rights, the state is supreme. Neither actually practice democracy. And they always replace religion with some type of competing belief. Humans, for all of time, we need something to believe in. Even if you believe in atheism, or you believe in spiritualism, or religion, or some type of political movement. And so the Soviets, they replaced this belief system with atheism. But then what does that result in? This cult of personality around leaders. Stalin killed 20 million people, but millions mourned and attended his funeral. So it's this idealization. In Germany, of course, they idealize and worship racial superiority, right? So you have these competing parties, and this contributes to World War II. This is part of why it occurs. But we see the destruction of these forces coming together through Picasso's Guernica. So he was commissioned, before the end of this war, he was commissioned by the Republicans, by this party, to create an artwork on the more national scale. He had moved out of Spain. So to create this artwork in support of the nationalists. And so what he does is he depicts this massive painting. You can see how large it is. It's now, I saw it at the Prado Museum in Spain, of this one event in this Basque town of all civilians where the German and Italian fascist forces under General Francisco Franco, so a Spaniard, the Spaniard on the nationalist side, Franco, asked German and Italian fascist forces to bomb his own people. Like, they were just civilians. And so they come in and they destroy, and about 1,200 people die, including women and children and all that. This wasn't that they were bombing the military. They bombed helpless civilians. And so he depicts this scene and the atrocities of all of this. And this is such foretelling of a war that's about to occur two years from now, or a great world war. And so we have, this is why it's called the last great history painting, because it's a depiction of this historical event. It's political in this aspect, and it's monumental. Think of our history paintings that have been monumental and extremely large. And it's, again, I mean, Franco killed his own people. Like, he ordered his own people to die. And so he depicts this scene. And in this case, he focuses purely on the victims of war. Okay, there's no focus on the heroes or even the enemy. He focuses purely on the victims. So let's analyze some of these aspects. So if we come over to, our eyes are usually drawn to the center. And so we have this horse who has just been impaled. We have this light bulb that also reminds us of an eye. Some people claim it's like the eyes of God, or like the evil eye trying to get rid of evil forces, but also this new industrialization, the light bulb versus this candle. But then our eyes line is used to draw our eyes to this figure, and where she's holding a light to this atrocious scene. We have this other person who's obviously in flames under this destruction. And we see these figures that are distorted, and obviously a woman, and as well as dismembered body parts. This is an arm that's been detached from a person with also slit open, essentially, but holding a knife, a sword, which was not used in this war by this point, but we associate that with warfare and battles, and it's broken. But a flower is starting to emerge, and it's kind of see-through. So some art historians argue that this represents hope, that out of this, there's still hope. We come over here, again, this dismembered head, this arm. Some argue that some of these markings represent the stigmata, like the markings that Christ had on his hand when he was crucified. Seems like a stretch. There's this idea of other limbs and an infant being held by a mother as she's screaming over the death of her child. This bull, which represents Spain, think bullfights. And this massive destruction. It's also black and white, and these little tiny lines are supposed to represent like a newspaper, that people should know about this, that he wants the rest of the world to know the news of this bombing of the town of Guernica, of this destruction. Yes, it was commissioned by the Republicans. On a national scale. It was shown elsewhere. Picasso, I think, had moved to France at this point. Was he in Spain? Wherever he was, eventually under World War II, the Nazis basically hold him under gunpoint in his studio and try to make him produce art for Hitler. But anyway, so we have this epic scene of mass destruction. It shows the chaos and the brutality of war. Okay, comments, questions? All right, so World War II, 1939 to 1945. We talked a lot about art reactions to World War I during World War I. However, this war is different because we have so many more people involved. It is a much bigger war with many more bodies, and so we aren't going to see as much art produced during it because all of those men are off at war. America is now, or at least by 41, we're fully involved. I mean, compare this death count. Here's World War I versus World War II. So we aren't going to see the same number of artworks produced during the war. In our next unit, we'll talk about the huge changes right after the war that occur. And so here we are. Also, since I'm talking about World War II, I just want to point out, this isn't like an artwork or ID, But the swastika of Nazism, it's like a really atrocious story because this symbol has been around for millennia. So it seems like thousands of years. And you'll see it throughout Hindu and Buddhist countries, especially like East and Southeast Asia, where we see a lot of Buddhism, and elsewhere actually. And the word swastika is a Sanskrit name. It's an ancient Sanskrit name. And we see it in these prayers in the Rig Veda. We see it in the texts and symbolism in ancient Hinduism, in the Buddhist sutras. In Buddhism, it was called Manji, and it signifies where the Buddha's footsteps were. It marks the location of Buddhist temples. So if you go elsewhere in the world and you see the symbol, it has the complete opposite connotation, where it's a much more positive connotation. It's very important in terms of religion and spirituality. And so Hitler knowingly took this name. I mean, he even took the Sanskrit name. He didn't even change it to anything German, and he used it for something for such evil. So if you ever travel and you see this elsewhere, note that in no way, shape, or form whatsoever is it associated with Nazism, that they stole this very precious, good symbol and they turned it into something very evil. So just kind of FYI. Okay, let's head to America. So American art, we talked about John Singleton Copley. Here's Paul Revere. Now remember, we're far removed geographically. We don't have any official art schools for a little bit. And so we are looking at this neoclassical piece, but it also has these Baroque elements, these Rococo elements. It also has, of course, our American Revolutionary elements. It's political in that regard. And so we have these differences, again, because we're away geographically from these European movements. We have different priorities going on. We have a Revolutionary War, Civil War, we have other things. And we start to get our first art schools in the 19th century, such as we talked about the Oxbow, Thomas Cole and his Hudson River School. And so we're establishing our own art schools. So we'll see changes with modernism, but we are not reacting against the established academies because we don't have those here. And so our art is very different. Copley also, here's Romanticism. But again, our Oxbow showed that. So we're experimenting with these European ideas, but in a little different way because we're removed. Here's an example of Realism, a portrait of Samuel D. Gross, where we're showing an early version of a surgery. I mean, look at that. No gloves, no nothing, just everyone's looking. But anyway. And so our art is different. So this looks different. Here's American Realism in a very different context and subject matter than what we see elsewhere. Again, because we have different things going on in priorities and values and interests. Boxing was huge in the 20s and 30s in America. There's a really good movie called Cinderella Man in the 30s during the Great Depression and how boxing was used for like American morale and stuff. But so what we see here is George Bellows is a famous American Realism artist in the 20s. And so he's showing this boxing match. And look at our figure style, how different it is than what we've seen in in Europe. It's got this idealized, muscular, realistic body, but then the face is a little more stylized, right? So maybe he's pulling from some of the elements going on in Europe, or we just have different priorities, right? We don't have this established academy here. Here's another one where his brushstrokes are getting much looser. It's kind of these romantic brushstrokes, but this is not anything related to Romanticism. There's no landscape, etc. But just to show we're producing a different kind of art. We're taking a different trajectory. And so here is Grant Wood's American Gothic to start to introduce the concept of social realism and regionalism. And so social realism is this art movement that occurs even in like Central America, and it's art for change, used for change. And in this regard, we're not quite there yet, hence why I'm also calling it regionalism in this painting. But we're elevating the backbone of America, American farmers. You've seen this one before. It's popular in pop culture. And so let's talk about a few key aspects. So of course we have these two figures, right? And we have our centrally placed element of the farming industry, sharp, it's pointy. We can imagine this quickly being used for, hey, they're very serious. They're the backbone of America. It seems like a husband and wife. But this is actually Grant Wood's daughter and his dentist. And so he had them, he modeled this depiction after them. They weren't married or anything. He just used them as figures to create this artwork. Behind him is this architectural style in America that is called Carpenter Gothic. This is a revival style. So think of like our neoclassical was a revival of the classical. The Gothic period, this is studied last semester. It's a fall semester style in the 1200s, late medieval. But it's defined by these pointed arches. And so we have this resurgent interest, which of course, where did these pointed arches come from? Islamic art, right? But yeah, so we see this American style. This is completely American, with the architecture behind them, as well as our backbone of America farmers, our seriousness. He's from Iowa, and so he's depicting what he knows. Here are the real people. Apparently you can still go to this house and tour it and take a picture with these props. Okay, so let's talk more about social realism. And we're going to start, yes, this unit is based on post-World War I through World War II, but I'm going to briefly go backwards a little bit with this social realism to start with our Cotton Mill Girl by Lewis Hines, 1908. And really your notes are going to come from these. Okay, so here's our key point for understanding this idea of social realism, because it worked in between our world wars. These acts were enacted. Child labor did end, and mostly it was because of these photographs. Art was used to persuade the public to do better for social changes. And so he does that. So your notes are primarily from those assigned resources. They're linked, so make sure to take those notes over them. I also want to talk about Dorothy Lang, migrant worker. If you haven't seen this yet, you will. You probably have, but now you'll recognize it and know more about it. So she is, Dorothy Lang was hired by where are we at? Go forward, sorry. The U.S. government's Farm Security Administration, FSA program, formed during the Great Depression to provide aid to impoverished farmers. So this is during our Great Depression. This is during our, the Great Famine from that was occurring in America. And so she's one of many, and here she is in different aspects, who were struggling to such extremities, where she's obviously living in a tent. They're trying to find work. She's a mother of numerous children. So she looks really old, right? She's actually only 35. I'm older than her. But we see the strain, this emphasis on her face, the centrally placed composition, and particularly on her even versus the children, to emphasize the strain of this, the heaviness, the weight of what families were going through during this time period. And as well as the hopelessness. The furrowed brows of contemplation and the frown and resting on her hand creates this feeling of pure distraught, of hopelessness, of where she, they don't know what to do next. So many people struggle just looking and never found what they were looking for until our World War broke out. But notice how even the children are looking away. The emphasis isn't on them. As well as his compositional framing that similar to Hines, where the focus is on the people rather than the background, that shallow depth. Here's another. This is actually an early example of kind of our pre-Photoshop era, where it was manually, certain aspects were edited out for the main purpose. And so there's actually a thumb. Someone had their hand on this pole holding up the tent here, and so that was edited out later. So this was one of the photos that were in publication, and it became really popular, and it actually resulted in Social Security. The reason why we have any of these Social Security plans, even with welfare, et cetera, are because of these photographs. And so this social realism of where art is used to enact social change, with the original intention of these people who really had no choice. They didn't want Americans to suffer like this as they did during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl. And so we will talk more about modern art tomorrow.